The events that the poems portray, the war of the Greek allies against Troy, and the return of Odysseus to his homeland in Ithaca, reflect the culture of a much earlier period, the Bronze Age. Modern scholars estimate the 10-year siege of Troy to have taken place between 1260 and 1180 BC. This is a very different world from classical Greece in the 5th century BC. Ancient Greek history is usually divided into the following periods: the Bronze Age, the Dark Age, the Archaic period, the Classical period, and the Hellenistic period. Scholars argue about the exact dates, especially of the earlier periods, but this scheme provides us with a framework that can be used to give some general points of orientation. The Homeric poems thus describe events from the earliest period, although they were apparently only committed to writing towards the end of the Dark Age, at some point between 800 and 600 BC, or even later. This thus makes the Homeric poems all the more valuable as cultural artifacts and sources of information about Bronze Age culture. As was the case with the Old Testament, books that we discussed, once the text was written down, it was presumably changed here and there by later writers intending to correct or improve it. It has long been debated whether the works are to be conceived as historical records or sheer fiction. In ancient times, people tended to think that the stories of Homer represented real people and events. There were even attempts made to identify the topology of the episodes of the Odyssey and trace Odysseus' route on a map. In modern times, the historical approach was bolstered with the discovery of the ruins of Troy in the 1870s by the German businessman Heinrich Schliemann. He argued vigorously that the Trojan War was a real event. By contrast, the opposite view claims that the poems arose from the imagination of their author or authors. Episodes from the Odyssey about witches, monsters, giants, and magic spells all seem to point to an origin in a tradition of folk tales. The lack of success in trying to identify specific places in the story, it's argued, is testimony to the fact that the narrative is intentionally set in the realm of make-believe. These debates are misguided, since they are predicated on a clear-cut distinction from our own modern times, namely that between a scholarly history, which attempts to document events from the past, and fiction, which aims primarily at entertainment with no claim to having any correspondence with the real world. But in the Bronze Age, this distinction didn't exist. It was not as if there were works of history and works of fiction, and the author then made a conscious choice for the one or the other. The very idea of scholarly history was only invented many centuries later, just as the idea of science only arose later out of religion. This explains why the poems presumably contain a mixture of fact and fiction. The author perceived the world in this way, and not with our modern categories. The story of the Odyssey is, at first glance, fairly straightforward. Odysseus, one of the heroes from the Trojan War, attempts to return home with his men. Along the way, they meet with a number of intriguing characters, and experience great adventures, and endure several hardships. Back at home in Ithaca, Odysseus is presumed dead, since so many years have passed with no word from him. His wife Penelope is hard-pressed by opportunistic suitors who wish to marry her. After losing all of his men, Odysseus finally makes it back to his beloved Ithaca, where he regains his wife, home, and title after having defeated the suitors in an armed conflict.